The thunder of hooves echoed across the dusty plains as Thomas Jameson raced his stallion toward the distant plume of smoke rising from Deadman's Ravine. His heart pounded against his ribs, matching the rhythm of his horse's gallop. The stagecoach had been overdue at Silverado station for hours, and when he'd spotted that ominous black smoke curling against the azure Wyoming sky, he knew his worst fears had materialized. "Come on, Shadow." Thomas urged his midnight black stallion forward, the wind whipping his auburn hair beneath his worn Stetson. The year was 1876, and the Wyoming Territory was still wild and untamed, much like Thomas himself. At 28, he'd already lived several lifetimes raised on a ranch, fought in skirmishes with hostile bands, and now worked as a scout and occasional deputy for the growing township of Silverado. The ravine came into view, a jagged scar cutting through the landscape, and Thomas's blood ran cold at what he saw. The Carson and Wells stagecoach teetered precariously over the edge, its back wheels suspended in midair while the front axle had somehow caught on an outcropping of rock. It swayed gently in the breeze, a precarious pendulum between life and death. "Whoa, boy," Thomas reined Shadow to a halt, quickly dismounting and securing him to a nearby juniper. The scene before him was one of devastation. The driver and shotgun rider lay motionless on the ground, their bodies at unnatural angles. 2 horses from the team were down as well, while the others had broken free and fled. Thomas approached carefully, scanning for any sign of bandits or attackers. The coach had been carrying the weekly mail and, if rumor held true, a Wells Fargo shipment. That alone would have made it a target. "Hello," he called out, his voice echoing across the ravine. "Anyone alive?" A faint sound reached his ears, a whimper, perhaps, or a moan. It was coming from the stagecoach. Thomas approached the edge, his boots sending small cascades of pebbles down into the abyss. The drop was at least 100 feet onto jagged rocks. The coach hung by what seemed like a miracle, the front axle somehow wedged against an outcropping of stone. "Hello," he called again, inching closer to the precipice. This time the response was clear, a woman's voice, weak but determined. "Help us, please," Thomas's mind raced. The stagecoach was too precarious to approach directly. One wrong move, one shift in weight, and it would plummet to the bottom, taking any survivors with it. "How many of you are in there?" he shouted. "Just 2 now," came the strained reply. "My father, he's badly hurt, I can't move him." Thomas assessed the situation quickly. The front axle was the only thing keeping the coach from falling. If he could somehow secure it, he might be able to reach the passengers. He returned to Shadow and retrieved his lasso and a length of sturdy rope. His plan was desperate, but it was the only chance those people had. Working swiftly, Thomas secured one end of the rope to the sturdiest tree he could find, a gnarled old oak that had somehow managed to grow in this harsh environment. He tied the other end around his waist, creating a lifeline. "I'm coming down to you," he called to the coach. "Just hold on tight and don't make any sudden movements." With his heart in his throat, Thomas began his descent down the rock face toward the coach. Every step was a calculated risk. One slip could send both him and the coach tumbling into the ravine. When he reached the level of the coach, he saw just how precarious its position was. The wooden axle was cracking under the strain, splintering ominously. "Miss," Thomas called, inching closer to the coach door that faced the ravine wall. "I'm going to try to reach you, but I need to crawl across the axle to get to the door. It might shift the coach, so brace yourself." "We're ready," came the reply, steadier now that help had arrived. Thomas took a deep breath and began to crawl across the wooden axle. It creaked under his weight, and he could feel it bending. The stagecoach shifted slightly, eliciting a terrified gasp from inside. "It's all right," Thomas said, trying to keep his voice calm despite his racing heart. "Just a little farther." He reached the coach door and peered inside. A young woman with honey blonde hair was cradling an older man's head in her lap. Blood stained the side of the man's face, and his eyes were closed. The woman's blue dress was torn and splattered with dust and blood, but her green eyes were clear and determined. "I'm Thomas Jameson," he said, extending his hand. "I'm going to get you both out of here." "Hannah Keller," she replied, taking his hand briefly. "And this is my father, George. He hit his head when the coach went off the road." Thomas assessed the situation. The coach was too unstable to risk trying to remove George first. Hannah would have to come out, and then they'd figure out how to extract her injured father. "Miss Keller, I need you to come with me first, then we can use the rope to help your father." Hannah hesitated, looking down at her father. "I can't leave him." "You have to," Thomas said firmly. "The coach could go at any moment. If you're out, you can help me get him to safety." After a moment's hesitation, Hannah nodded. "What do I need to do?" "Take my hand and climb carefully toward me. Don't make any sudden movements." Hannah gently lowered her father's head to the cushioned seat and moved toward Thomas. The coach swayed alarmingly as she shifted her weight. "Easy now," Thomas coached. "One hand at a time." Hannah reached the door and Thomas grasped her firmly by the waist, helping her onto the axle beside him. The wood creaked ominously beneath their combined weight. "Wrap your arms around my neck," Thomas instructed. "I'll get us back to solid ground." Hannah did as she was told, her body trembling against his as Thomas began the careful journey back across the axle. Every step was a test of balance and nerve, the coach shifting beneath them with each movement. When they finally reached the cliff face, Thomas helped Hannah find handholds in the rock. "Follow me up," he said. "I'll be right above you." They climbed slowly, Hannah showing surprising strength and determination despite her ordeal. When they reached the top, Thomas pulled her onto solid ground, both of them collapsing in relief. "Thank you," Hannah said, her voice shaking. "But we need to go back for my father." Thomas nodded, already planning his approach. "The coach is too unstable now. I'll need to secure it better before I try to get him out." Working quickly, Thomas fashioned a more elaborate system of ropes, creating a harness that he could use to descend more safely. The stagecoach had shifted further since their last attempt, now hanging even more precariously. "I'm going back down," Thomas told Hannah. "If I can reach your father, I'll secure this rope around him and we can pull him up." Hannah grasped his arm, her green eyes intense. "Be careful, please." Thomas descended again, the task even more dangerous now that the coach had shifted. As he crawled across the axle once more, he could hear the wood splintering beneath him. The entire coach lurched suddenly, dropping several inches before catching again. Thomas froze, heart hammering. He was running out of time. He reached the door and looked inside. George Keller remained unconscious, a bad sign. Blood had pooled beneath his head and his breathing was shallow. "Mr. Keller," Thomas said loudly, trying to rouse the man. "Sir, can you hear me?" There was no response. Thomas would have to pull him out without his help. He crawled inside the coach, the entire vehicle groaning in protest at the additional weight. "Hannah," Thomas called up. "Be ready with that rope. I'm going to try to pass him to you." Thomas carefully maneuvered George toward the door. The older man was heavy, and moving him caused the coach to sway dangerously. Thomas's muscles strained with the effort of controlling both the unconscious man and his own movements to minimize the rocking of the coach. Just as Thomas got George to the door, a sickening crack sounded from the axle. The coach dropped another foot, now hanging by the barest margin. "Thomas," Hannah screamed from above. "It's all right," Thomas called back, though he knew it was far from all right. He had seconds, maybe, before the axle gave way completely. With a surge of desperate strength, Thomas pushed George's limp form through the door and onto the small ledge formed by the coach's running board. "Hannah, lower the rope." Now, Hannah's rope snaked down and Thomas quickly secured it under George's arms, creating a crude harness. "Pull him up." Thomas shouted, helping to guide George's unconscious form away from the coach and toward the cliff face. Hannah and Thomas worked in concert, her pulling from above while Thomas pushed and guided from below. Inch by agonizing inch, they moved George up the rock face. Just as George's feet cleared the coach's roof, the axle gave way with a thunderous crack. The stagecoach plummeted into the ravine, crashing against the rocks below in an explosion of splintered wood and twisted metal. Thomas clung to the rope, swinging wildly against the cliff face as the coach disappeared below him. For a terrible moment, he thought the rope might snap under the sudden strain, but it held. "Thomas," Hannah's panicked voice echoed down to him. "Are you all right?" "I'm fine." He called back, though his heart was racing and his arms trembling from exertion. "Keep pulling your father up. I'll climb alongside." Thomas began his ascent, muscles burning with the effort. Above him, Hannah continued to pull her father's limp form up the cliff face, her slender frame somehow finding the strength needed for the task. When they finally reached the top, all three collapsed on the solid ground. Thomas quickly checked George's condition. The man was alive but badly injured. He needs a doctor, Thomas said, looking at Hannah. Silverado is closest, about 5 miles from here. My horse can carry double. We'll have to leave your father secured here and come back for him with a wagon. Hannah's eyes filled with worry. Leave him. But he's hurt, and there might be bandits. We don't have a choice, Miss Keller, Thomas said gently. He needs medical attention that we can't provide here, and we can't carry him all the way to town. Hannah looked at her father, then back at Thomas. After a moment, she nodded. All right. But we need to make him as comfortable as possible first. They worked together to move George to a sheltered spot beneath the juniper tree. Thomas used his canteen to clean the worst of the blood from the man's face, then fashioned a pillow from his own saddlebag. The stagecoach, Hannah said suddenly, looking down into the ravine. There was a strongbox. My father was transporting bank documents to Cheyenne. Thomas followed her gaze to the wreckage below. Was anyone else supposed to be on this coach? Hannah shook her head. No, just us and the driver and guard. She paused, her expression clouding. They're dead, aren't they? I saw them when we were hanging there. Thomas nodded grimly. I'm afraid so. Looks like they were thrown clear when the coach went over. Did you see what happened? Was it an accident or an attack? An attack, Hannah said, her voice hardening. 4 men on horseback. They wore bandanas over their faces. They shot at us, killed the guard first, then the driver lost control. Thomas's jaw tightened. The Blackwell gang had been terrorizing this stretch of road for months. It sounded like their work. Let's get you to town, he said. We can send a posse back for your father and to recover what's left of the mail and that strongbox. Thomas helped Hannah onto Shadow's back, then swung up behind her. The proximity was intimate, her back pressed against his chest as he reached around her to take the reins. Hold tight, he said, and spurred Shadow into motion. As they rode toward Silverado, Thomas became increasingly aware of the woman pressed against him. Despite the dust and blood on her dress, a faint floral scent clung to her hair. She sat straight and tall in the saddle, betraying a familiarity with horses. You ride well, he commented as they navigated a shallow creek crossing. I grew up on a horse farm in Kentucky, Hannah replied. Before the war. The Civil War had ended 11 years ago, but its shadow still stretched long across the nation. Thomas had been just a boy when it ended, but he remembered the chaos it had brought to his Missouri home. What brings you out west? He asked, partly from curiosity and partly to keep her mind off her injured father. A fresh start, Hannah said simply, then elaborated after a moment's silence. My mother died last year. Father decided there was nothing left for us in Kentucky. He took a position with First National Bank in Cheyenne. We were on our way there when. Her voice trailed off. I'm sorry about your mother, Thomas said, and today's troubles. Hannah turned slightly, offering him a small smile over her shoulder. You have nothing to apologize for, Mr. Jameson. You saved our lives. Their eyes met briefly, and Thomas felt something stir within him, an unexpected connection. He quickly looked away, focusing on the trail ahead. They rode in companionable silence for a while before Hannah spoke again. What about you? Have you always lived in Wyoming? No, madam. Missouri born and raised. Came out here after my parents died of the fever 5 years back. Thought I'd try my hand at prospecting, but found I was better suited to scouting and guiding. Sheriff Hardin sometimes deputizes me when he needs an extra gun. Is that what you were doing today? Sheriff's business? Thomas shook his head. No, just happened to be heading back to town and saw the smoke. Good thing, too. Yes, Hannah said softly, a very good thing. They crested a rise, and Silverado came into view, a small but growing town nestled in a valley, its buildings clustered around a main street with scattered homesteads dotting the surrounding countryside. That's it? Hannah asked, surprise evident in her voice. Thomas chuckled. Were you expecting something grander? No, In Kentucky, we heard tales of booming western towns. I suppose I pictured something more substantial. Silverado's young yet, Thomas explained, but it's growing. We've got a sawmill, a general store, 2 saloons, a hotel, even a small schoolhouse now. And Dr. Martin, who's going to help your father." They rode into town, attracting curious glances from the townsfolk. Thomas headed straight for the small building that served as both the doctor's office and home. Dr. Elias Martin was a white-haired veteran of the war who had come west seeking peace and found a town in desperate need of his skills. He hurried out to meet them as Thomas helped Hannah dismount. "What happened?" the doctor asked, taking in Hannah's disheveled appearance. "Stagecoach accident at Deadman's Ravine," Thomas explained quickly. "Her father's still out there, head injury, unconscious. We need a wagon to bring him in, doctor." Martin nodded, already turning to his assistant who had appeared in the doorway. "Frank, go get Sullivan's wagon, and stop by the sheriff's office, let Hardin know what's happened." The young man nodded and took off at a run. "Come inside, miss," Dr. Martin said to Hannah. "Let me take a look at you while we wait." Hannah shook her head. "I'm fine, just some bruises. We need to get back to my father." "Hannah," Thomas said gently, using her first name without thinking, "let the doctor check you over. We'll head back out as soon as the wagon's ready. It won't help your father if you collapse from injuries you didn't know you had." Hannah hesitated, then nodded reluctantly. "All right, but please hurry." While Dr. Martin examined Hannah in his office, Thomas headed to the sheriff's office to report what had happened. Sheriff Hardin was a gruff man in his 50s, his face weathered by years in the sun and wind. "Blackwell's gang," the sheriff muttered when Thomas described the attack. "This is the third coach they've hit this month. Did the lady say what was in that strongbox?" "Bank documents," she said. "Her father works for First National in Cheyenne." Hardin's bushy eyebrows shot up. "George Keller, the new manager?" Thomas nodded. "You know him, know of him. Bank's been sending telegrams all over, wanting to know where he is. They were expecting him 2 days ago." The sheriff stood, strapping on his gun belt. "I'll gather some men. We need to get out to that ravine before Blackwell's boys decide to come back for whatever's in that box." Within the hour, a small posse was assembled: Thomas, Sheriff Hardin, and 3 deputies. Sullivan's wagon had been readied with Dr. Martin inside, prepared to treat George Keller on the spot if necessary. Hannah insisted on accompanying them, despite Thomas's concerns. "He's my father," she said firmly. "I'm going." They made good time back to the ravine, approaching cautiously in case Blackwell's gang had returned. But the site was quiet, with George Keller still unconscious but alive where they had left him. "Doctor." Martin immediately set to work, cleaning and bandaging the head wound while the deputies secured the area. Thomas and one of the deputies, a man named Parker, climbed down to recover what they could from the wrecked stagecoach. The strongbox had been thrown clear of the wreckage and lay partially buried in scree at the bottom of the ravine. It was locked and seemingly intact. They also recovered mail bags and the personal belongings of the Kellers, including a small trunk of Hannah's. By the time they climbed back up, Dr. Martin had stabilized George and prepared him for transport. "He's got a serious concussion," the doctor told Hannah. "Possibly a skull fracture. I won't know more until I get him back to my office. But he's strong and his pulse is steady. That's a good sign." Hannah nodded, her face pale but composed. "Thank you, doctor." The journey back to Silverado was tense but uneventful. Sheriff Hardin rode ahead with 2 deputies to ensure the road was clear, while Thomas rode alongside the wagon, keeping a watchful eye on Hannah, who sat beside her father, holding his hand. Back in town, George Keller was installed in Dr. Martin's back room, which served as a small hospital ward. Hannah refused to leave his side, so Thomas took it upon himself to secure them rooms at the Silverado Hotel for when George was well enough to be moved. "I don't know how to thank you," Hannah said when Thomas returned to the doctor's office with some fresh clothing he'd purchased for her at the general store. The dress was simple but clean, a vast improvement over her torn and bloodied garments. "No need for thanks," Thomas said, suddenly feeling awkward. "Anyone would have done the same." Hannah's eyes met his, a small smile playing at her lips. "No, Mr. Jameson, not anyone would have crawled across a broken axle to save strangers from certain death." Thomas felt heat rise in his cheeks and changed the subject. "How's your father doing?" "Better. He woke up briefly. He didn't remember the attack, but he recognized me. Dr. Martin says that's a good sign. It is, Thomas agreed. Listen, I've got some business to attend to, but I'll check back on you both this evening. Is there anything you need in the meantime? Hannah shook her head. You've done more than enough already. Thomas tipped his hat and headed out, strangely reluctant to leave her presence. He just met this woman, yet he felt drawn to her in a way he couldn't explain. The business he needed to attend to was a meeting with Sheriff Hardin and the bank manager from Silverado's small branch. The strongbox had been brought to the sheriff's office, and they needed to determine what to do with it. Technically, it should continue on to Cheyenne, the bank manager, a thin man named Wilcox, was saying. But with Keller laid up and Blackwell's gang still out there. We could wire Cheyenne, Sheriff Hardin suggested, see what they want us to do. In the meantime, we should keep it in your bank vault, Thomas suggested to Wilcox. It's safer there than here at the office. Both men agreed, and arrangements were made to transfer the strongbox. Thomas couldn't help wondering what was so important about those bank documents that Blackwell's gang would attack a stagecoach for them. As promised, Thomas returned to the doctor's office that evening. Dr. Martin met him at the door. He's awake, the doctor said, confused but talking. I think he's going to pull through. Relief washed over Thomas. That's good news. How's Miss Keller holding up? Exhausted but won't admit it. See if you can convince her to get some rest. I've told her we've got a cot set up for her in there, but she's determined to sit in that chair all night. Thomas nodded and headed into the back room. Hannah sat beside her father's bed, her hand resting on his. She looked up when Thomas entered, her face lighting with a smile that made his heart skip a beat. Mr. Jameson, she said softly, look who's awake. George Keller's eyes were open, though somewhat unfocused. He regarded Thomas with confusion. Do I know you, sir? No, sir, Thomas replied, stepping closer to the bed. Thomas Jameson. I helped you and your daughter after the stagecoach accident. Recognition flickered in the older man's eyes. Yes, Hannah told me. I owe you my life, it seems. You don't owe me anything, Mr. Keller. I'm just glad you're on the mend. George nodded weakly, then his eyes drooped. Within moments, he was asleep again. Dr. Martin says he'll sleep a lot for the next few days, Hannah explained. But each time he wakes, he's a little more clear-headed. That's good, Thomas said. You should get some rest yourself. Hannah smiled tiredly. You sound like Dr. Martin, smart man, the doctor. Thomas gestured to the small cot in the corner. I've secured rooms for you both at the hotel, but until your father can be moved, you should at least use that. Hannah glanced at the cot, then back at her father. I don't want to leave him. The cot's right there, Thomas pointed out. You won't be leaving him. Just giving your body a chance to recover. Hannah hesitated, then nodded. Perhaps you're right. I usually am, Thomas said with a smile. I'll leave you to it then. I'll come by in the morning to check on you both. Thank you, Thomas, Hannah said, the use of his first name feeling oddly intimate in the quiet room. For everything. As Thomas stepped out into the cool evening air, he realized that somewhere in the course of this chaotic day, he had developed feelings for Hannah Keller that went beyond mere concern for a person he'd rescued. The realization was both surprising and unsettling. Thomas had never been one to form quick attachments. Life in the West had taught him caution. People came and went, sometimes disappearing as quickly as they had arrived. Getting too attached only led to heartache. Yet there was something about Hannah that had broken through his usual reserve. Her strength, her determination, the way she'd maintained her composure despite the terrifying ordeal, all of it spoke to a character that resonated with his own. Over the next few days, Thomas found himself spending more and more time at the doctor's office, checking on George's progress, and if he was honest with himself, seeking Hannah's company. They talked about their lives before Wyoming, about books they'd read, about their hopes for the future. Hannah spoke of her dream to open a small school someday, having been educated at a ladies' seminary in Louisville before the war changed everything. Thomas shared stories of his scouting adventures, of the beautiful and sometimes brutal landscape he'd come to love. 5 days after the accident, Dr. Martin declared George well enough to be moved to the hotel. Thomas helped with the transfer, carrying the older man's few belongings and making sure the hotel room was prepared with extra pillows and fresh water. As George settled into the hotel bed, he fixed Thomas with a clearer gaze than he'd yet managed. "Young man, I need to speak with you privately." Hannah looked surprised but nodded when Thomas glanced at her. "I'll go fetch some fresh tea from downstairs," she said, leaving the two men alone. When the door closed behind her, George struggled to sit up straighter. "Mr. Jameson, I need your help." "Of course, sir. What can I do?" "The strongbox," George said, his voice low and urgent. "It doesn't just contain bank documents. There are securities and bonds worth over $50,000 in there." Thomas whistled low. "That's why Blackwell's gang targeted your coach," George nodded grimly. "Someone must have leaked the information. Those papers need to reach Cheyenne, or a lot of people stand to lose their life savings." "The box is in the Silverado bank vault for now," Thomas assured him. "Sheriff Hardin wired Cheyenne, and they're sending armed guards to collect it. They should be here in a day or two." Relief washed over George's face. "Thank God, I was afraid." He trailed off, then fixed Thomas with an intense gaze. "I've been watching you with my daughter." Thomas felt heat rise in his cheeks. "Sir, I assure you," George waved a hand dismissively. "No need for assurances. Hannah is a grown woman, and I've never seen her smile the way she does when you're around, not since her mother died." He paused, studying Thomas's face. "You're an honorable man, from what I can tell. That's rare out here." "I try to be, sir," George nodded. "Hannah and I were supposed to make a new start in Cheyenne, but I'm thinking now that perhaps Silverado might be a better place for us." Thomas's heart leaped at the implication, but before he could respond, the door opened and Hannah returned with a tray of tea. The conversation shifted to more mundane matters, but Thomas caught George's knowing glance more than once during his visit. It seemed he had the father's approval, should he wish to court Hannah, and Thomas was increasingly certain that was exactly what he wished to do. The next morning brought unexpected trouble. Thomas was at the livery stable, tending to Shadow, when Sheriff Hardin burst in, his face grim. "Blackwell's been spotted," the sheriff said without preamble. "Him and his boys are camped just outside town, according to Jenkins, who was coming back from his trapline." Thomas straightened, brushing hay from his hands. "They're coming for the strongbox. That would be my guess. I've got the deputies watching the bank, but there are only 5 of us, counting you. And probably 8 or 10 of them," Thomas said grimly. It was no secret that Blackwell's gang had been growing larger and more bold in recent months. "We need to move the Kellers somewhere safer," Thomas decided. "If Blackwell knows what was in that strongbox, he might also know who was carrying it." The sheriff nodded. "Good thinking. My house is at the edge of town. Hannah and her father can stay there with my wife until this is over. Martha's a good shot if it comes to that." Thomas quickly saddled Shadow and rode to the hotel. Hannah was surprised to see him, especially when he explained the situation. "Bandits in town?" she asked, her voice dropping to a whisper so as not to alarm her father, who was dozing in the adjacent room. "Not yet, but they're nearby. Sheriff Hardin is offering you and your father sanctuary at his home. It's more defensible than the hotel." Hannah nodded, her practical nature asserting itself. "We'll need to pack quickly. Father is much better but still weak." They worked together to gather the Kellers' belongings, and within half an hour, George was settled in Sheriff Hardin's wagon with Hannah beside him. Thomas rode alongside as they made their way to the sheriff's small but sturdy home on the outskirts of Silverado. Martha Hardin, a no-nonsense woman with steel-gray hair and a warm smile, welcomed them inside. "Got the spare room already," she said, leading the way. "And I keep a loaded shotgun by the door, so don't you worry none." With the Kellers safely installed at the Hardin home, Thomas returned to town to help prepare for Blackwell's potential attack. The bank had been fortified, with sandbags stacked in front of the windows and armed men stationed strategically around the building. Night fell with no sign of the Blackwell gang, but no one relaxed their vigilance. Thomas took the first watch, stationed on the roof of the general store where he had a clear view of the main street. The hours crept by, the town eerily silent except for the occasional howl of a distant coyote. Thomas's thoughts kept drifting to Hannah, wondering if she was comfortable at the Hardin home, if she was frightened by the threat of violence. Just before dawn, Thomas spotted movement at the edge of town riders, moving stealthily between buildings. He fired a warning shot into the air, the signal they'd agreed upon. Instantly, the quiet town erupted into chaos. The Blackwell gang, realizing they'd been spotted, abandoned stealth for speed, charging down the main street toward the bank. Gunfire erupted from both sides. Thomas took careful aim from his elevated position, picking off one of the riders. The man tumbled from his horse, clutching his shoulder. Below, Sheriff Hardin and his deputies exchanged fire with the gang from behind their barricades. The townspeople who had volunteered to help joined in, creating a wall of resistance that the outlaws hadn't anticipated. 2 more of Blackwell's men fell, and the others began to waver. Thomas spotted Blackwell himself, a tall man with a distinctive red bandana, shouting orders to his remaining men. Suddenly, Blackwell veered away from the bank, heading instead toward the edge of town toward the sheriff's house. Thomas's blood ran cold. Somehow, Blackwell knew where the Kellers were. Without hesitation, Thomas scrambled down from his perch and raced to where Shadow was tethered. He swung into the saddle and spurred the horse into a gallop, taking a shortcut through the alleyways to intercept Blackwell before he reached the Hardin home. Thomas emerged onto the main road just as Blackwell was passing. He drove Shadow directly into the path of Blackwell's horse, causing both animals to rear and nearly throw their riders. "Jameson," Blackwell snarled, recognizing him, "should have known you'd be mixed up in this." Thomas leveled his revolver at Blackwell. "It's over, Blackwell. Your men are either dead or running. Drop your gun." Instead, Blackwell fired, the bullet whistling past Thomas's ear. Thomas returned fire, his shot catching Blackwell in the arm. The outlaw yelled in pain, but managed to stay on his horse, wheeling around and galloping toward the open country beyond town. Thomas pursued, determined not to let Blackwell escape. They raced across the open plain, the first rays of dawn illuminating the landscape in a golden glow. Shadow, fresher and faster than Blackwell's mount, began to close the gap. When he was within range, Thomas aimed carefully and fired again. This time, his bullet found its mark. Blackwell lurched in the saddle, then tumbled to the ground. Thomas reined Shadow to a halt and dismounted cautiously, his gun still trained on Blackwell. The outlaw lay motionless on the ground, blood spreading across his chest. "Should have killed you when I had the chance," Blackwell gasped, his eyes already growing dim. "When was that?" Thomas asked, keeping his distance. A bloody smile spread across Blackwell's face. "Carson City. 2 years ago, you were guiding that survey party." Thomas remembered the incident, an attack on a government survey team he'd been guiding. 2 men had died before the attackers were driven off. "That was you." Blackwell's only answer was a final, rattling breath. Then he was gone. Thomas rode back to town to find the battle over. 3 of Blackwell's men were dead, 2 were wounded and captured, and the rest had fled. On the defenders' side, 1 deputy had taken a bullet in the leg, and several townspeople had minor injuries, but miraculously, no one had been killed. Thomas's first concern was for Hannah and her father. He rode straight to the Hardin home, relief washing over him when he saw Martha standing on the porch, shotgun still in hand but a smile on her face. "We're all fine here," she assured him before he could ask. "Heard the shooting, but nobody came this way, except you just now." "Blackwell tried," Thomas explained. "I intercepted him." Inside, he found Hannah tending to her father, who looked pale but determined. When Hannah saw Thomas, she rushed to him, surprising them both by throwing her arms around him. "We heard the gunfire," she said, her voice muffled against his chest. "I was so afraid you'd be hurt." Thomas held her close, suddenly not caring who saw or what they might think. "I'm fine, and Blackwell won't be troubling anyone ever again." Over the next few days, as Silverado recovered from the attack and celebrated its successful defense, Thomas and Hannah grew even closer. They took walks together in the evenings, talking about everything and nothing, their hands occasionally brushing in a way that sent electricity up Thomas's arm. George Keller continued to improve and began making plans for their future. To Thomas's delight, George decided that Silverado, not Cheyenne, would be their new home. "The bank here needs a proper manager," George explained one evening as they all sat on the Hardens' porch. "And I believe Hannah mentioned something about this town needing a proper school as well." Hannah blushed but nodded. "I've spoken with Reverend Phillips. The church has a small building they're willing to let me use." Thomas couldn't keep the smile from his face. The idea of Hannah staying in Silverado permanently filled him with joy he hadn't known he was capable of feeling. 2 weeks after the Blackwell gang's defeat, the armed guards from Cheyenne finally arrived to escort the strongbox to its destination. The bank documents and securities would reach their intended recipients after all, albeit delayed. On their last night in the Harden home, before moving into the rooms above the bank that came with George's new position, Thomas invited Hannah for a walk by the small creek that ran at the edge of town. The evening was warm, the sky painted in shades of purple and gold as the sun set behind the distant mountains. They walked in comfortable silence for a while before Thomas gathered his courage. "Hannah," he began, stopping to face her, "these past weeks, getting to know you, they've been the happiest of my life." Hannah's eyes, reflecting the sunset, met his. "For me as well, Thomas." Thomas took her hands in his. "I know we haven't known each other long, but I feel as though I've been waiting for you my whole life without realizing it." He took a deep breath. "I love you, Hannah Keller, and if you'll have me, I want to court you properly, with your father's blessing." Hannah's face lit with a smile that rivaled the setting sun. "Thomas Jameson, I believe I've been falling in love with you since the moment you pulled me from that stagecoach." She squeezed his hands. "And yes, I would very much like to be courted by you." Thomas couldn't contain his joy. He leaned down, hesitating just a moment before Hannah rose on her tiptoes to meet him halfway. Their lips met in a sweet, tender kiss that promised much more to come. When they returned to the Harden home, hand in hand and glowing with happiness, George Keller took one look at them and chuckled. "Well, it's about time," he said, surprising them both. "I was beginning to think I'd have to lock you two in a room together. Father." Hannah exclaimed, blushing furiously. George just smiled. "I may be recovering from a head injury, my dear, but I'm not blind. This young man has been in love with you since he pulled you from that ravine, and unless I'm much mistaken, you feel the same way." Thomas stepped forward, standing tall. "Sir, with your permission, I'd like to court your daughter." George's expression softened. "You saved both our lives, Thomas. You protected us when Blackwell came, and most importantly, you make my daughter happier than I've seen her in years." He extended his hand. "You have more than my permission. You have my blessing." Over the following months, Silverado watched with approval as Thomas and Hannah's courtship blossomed. Hannah established her school, starting with just 8 pupils, but quickly growing to 20 as families from outlying farms and ranches sent their children to learn from the Kentucky-educated teacher. Thomas continued his work as a scout, but found himself taking fewer long-range assignments, preferring to stay close to Silverado and Hannah. He also accepted a permanent deputy position with Sheriff Hardin, helping to ensure that the peace they'd won from Blackwell's gang remained unbroken. George Keller flourished as well, transforming Silverado's small bank branch into a thriving institution that helped finance the town's growth and prosperity. As winter approached, bringing with it the 1-year anniversary of the Stagecoach accident, Thomas took Hannah back to Deadman's Ravine. The site looked different now, peaceful under a light dusting of early snow. No trace remained of the tragedy that had occurred there. "Why did you want to come here?" Hannah asked as they stood at the edge, looking down at the ravine below. Thomas smiled, taking her hand. "Because this is where my life truly began." He turned to face her, dropping to one knee in the snow. "Hannah Keller, a year ago I crawled across a broken axle and found not just a woman in distress, but the other half of my soul." He pulled a small box from his pocket and opened it to reveal a simple but elegant diamond ring. "Will you marry me and make every day of my life as meaningful as that one?" Tears filled Hannah's eyes as she nodded, too overcome for words at first. Then, finding her voice, she said, "Yes, Thomas. 1,000 times yes." He slipped the ring onto her finger, then stood and pulled her into his arms, sealing their promise with a kiss that warmed them despite the winter chill. Their wedding the following spring was the social event of the year in Silverado. The entire town turned out to celebrate as Hannah, radiant in a gown of ivory silk, walked down the aisle of the newly expanded church on her father's arm. Thomas, waiting at the altar in a new suit that felt strange after years of buckskins and denim, thought his heart might burst with happiness when he saw her. As they spoke their vows, Thomas couldn't help but reflect on the strange twist of fate that had brought them together: a broken axle, a stagecoach hanging precariously over a ravine, a desperate rescue. What had begun as the worst day of Hannah's life had become the first day of their life together. After the ceremony, as they greeted well-wishers at the reception held in the town square, Sheriff Hardin approached with his wife. "Never thought I'd see the day," the sheriff said, clapping Thomas on the shoulder. "Our wild scout tamed at last." Thomas laughed, his arm around Hannah's waist. "Not tamed, Sheriff, just found someone worth settling down for." Martha Hardin smiled knowingly. "That's how it works, dear," she told her husband. "You men think you're making a choice, but really, your hearts were captured long ago." As the celebration continued around them, Thomas and Hannah slipped away for a moment of quiet together. "Are you happy, Mrs. Jameson?" Thomas asked, still marveling at the sound of her new name. Hannah's eyes shone with love as she looked up at him. "Happier than I ever dreamed possible. And you, Mr. Jameson?" "I never knew such happiness existed," Thomas replied honestly. "And to think, if I hadn't happened to see that smoke rising from Deadman's Ravine." "I believe we were meant to find each other," Hannah said, resting her head against his chest. "Perhaps not in such a dramatic fashion, but I think our paths would have crossed eventually." "Well, I've always preferred the direct approach," Thomas said with a grin. "Though next time, maybe we can meet under less dangerous circumstances." Hannah laughed, the sound like music to his ears. "I think we've had enough danger to last a lifetime." They returned to the celebration, surrounded by friends who had become family. Secure in the knowledge that whatever the future held, they would face it together: the scout who had once roamed the wilderness alone, and the teacher who had found her true home in his arms. In the years that followed, Silverado continued to grow and prosper. Thomas and Hannah built a comfortable home at the edge of town, with a view of the distant mountains and plenty of room for the children they hoped would come. Hannah's school flourished, eventually moving into a proper schoolhouse built by the townspeople. Thomas continued as deputy sheriff while also establishing a successful guide service for the increasing number of settlers and businessmen coming to Wyoming Territory. 2 years after their wedding, Hannah gave birth to a daughter they named Rose, after Thomas's mother. George Keller, now fully recovered from his injuries and a pillar of the Silverado community, doted on his granddaughter shamelessly. As they watched little Rose take her first steps in the garden Thomas had planted for Hannah, he reflected on the long, strange journey that had brought them to this moment of perfect happiness. "What are you thinking about?" Hannah asked, noticing his contemplative expression. Thomas smiled, pulling her close as their daughter tottered toward them on unsteady legs. "I was just thinking that sometimes the most unexpected moments can lead to the greatest joys." He kissed Hannah's temple. "And that I'm the luckiest man in Wyoming Territory." Hannah smiled up at him, her green eyes still holding the same light that had captivated him that first day at Deadman's Ravine. "And I'm the luckiest woman to have found a man brave enough to crawl across a broken axle for a stranger." "Not a stranger," Thomas corrected, gathering Rose up as she reached them. "The love of my life, I just didn't know it yet." As the sun set behind the mountains, casting a golden glow over their little family, Thomas Jameson knew with absolute certainty that all the dangers and hardships he'd faced had been worth it, for they had led him here. To this moment, to this woman, to this life filled with love and purpose. And he wouldn't have changed a single step of the journey.